everybody. Welcome. A quick recap edition of Frenemies of the People. Eleni and I were talking about the fact that for several years I was press secretary to former Illinois Governor George Ryan, who just passed. Services are set for this week. And it sent me a bit down memory lane. And so Eleni thought we should capture it on video because she really respects my privacy. So what's on your mind, Eleni?
Yeah. So I've worked for an Illinois governor. You've worked for an Illinois governor. We've both worked for various elected officials along the way. Each of them special, each of them unique in their own way. So tell us a little bit, Dennis, about what it was like working for former Governor George Ryan.
I have to say that the things that I appreciated the most about him, because all of those elected officials you mentioned, including Governor Ryan, put some pretty unrealistic demands on staff. And you have some insane deadlines, crazy pressures. It's a bizarre way to live. But just about every evening, if he was in Chicago, and I was in Chicago more often than not, he would stop by my office and thank me. And that was at essence the kind of guy that he was. He was someone that appreciated efforts on his behalf, and then of course asked you to put forth those same efforts the next day and then some.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is very rare to hear thank yous. And I think that that's probably, I would say, without really knowing the man, probably one of his best attributes. And we're just getting started. So, one thing that George Ryan has been most well known for is the moratorium on the death penalty that he issued in 2000. That obviously won him international praise, and I believe that some would say was a bit of a surprise since he was known as a tough on crime politician. Tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you.
So this all it's a great example of when you get elected to, especially in executive office, governor, mayor, president, things come to your desk that just knock you off your plans. You might have had a agenda to do some ribbon cuttings or to have a meeting on the budget, and all of a sudden something like capital punishment shows up on your desk and it won't leave. And that was definitely the case here. The Illinois capital punishment system had been through a lot of drama in the years preceding the governor being in office. In fact, in fairness, the Sun Times did a lot of great reporting back in the day, as well as some of the Chicago TV stations. NBC5 in particular was pretty well known for their coverage of cases of the uh, Rolando Cruz case, for example, where he was found after a long and winding legal process to have been wrongfully convicted for an awful child murder, a child murder that another man who was in prison on an unrelated charge was willing to confess for committing. So the Illinois system had been under fire for a while, been under strain for a while, but the Chicago Tribune, with reporters Steve Mills and Ken Armstrong, did this exhaustive report in the fall of '99. And the governor was already under a lot of pressure, a lot of fire. He had a, unrelated, but some people thought related, federal investigation into his conduct during his former office as Secretary of State. And so, as we're getting to the end of the fall, he was in the bunker a little bit. And in fairness, he was doing a lot of planning for next year's budget plan, which was going to be the year 2000. And there was a lot of concern about where things were going with regard to Y2K, if you remember that. That was an oldie but a goodie.
Yep.
So he'd been out of pocket for a few weeks. Meanwhile, I'm getting calls from Chicago, downstate, TV, print about this series that the Tribune had been doing. And it was a sort of a aggregating of all of the screw ups in the Illinois capital punishment system over the years. And it brought out the activists who used the story as an opportunity to put it at the front of their agenda. And there were some good people that were involved with fighting the death penalty in Illinois who saw this series as the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the system. So the biggest takeaway was that there were at that point were 13 men who had been exonerated or had their cases found to have been uh, improperly tried and fatally flawed for things like single eyeball witnesses, incompetent attorneys. And in the case of one famous case, a gentleman by the name of Anthony Porter was convicted of a double shooting. He was questioned at the now notorious Southside John Burge Police Headquarters. And when Professor Larry Marshall at Northwestern got a delay in his execution, and he was 2 days away from being executed, and he got that delay based on mental competence. Some journalism students working under David Protes and Paul Cialino, who's a private investigator, found another individual who confessed on tape to committing the murder. Later on, that became a lot more controversial because people tried to help that individual step back from what he confessed to on the video. But the bottom line is that this case was fatally flawed, and it was very clear that the case against Porter had totally collapsed. And there was an infamous video where Anthony Porter is running out of court and into the arms of Professor Protes. So it was an image that really stuck with Governor Ryan. Now, fast forward several months later, he's got this Tribune series saying there's drunk attorneys, there's disbarred attorneys, and half of death row. We had about 26 people that had exhausted all their appeals, and half of those inmates had their cases kicked out because they either fell apart or they were exonerated by DNA and other compelling evidence. So I had a lot of opposition in the staff to doing something about this. A couple of his outside advisors were very much in favor of having the governor speak on this. And there's a lot of pressure. One of his outside advisors was a guy named Pete Peters, who had just a real knack for certain sorts of issues that could make an elected official, that could remind everybody why you voted for somebody, that you have a heart. He was a very emotional guy. And so he was lobbying for the governors to be himself and to do something here. Eventually, some of his key outside legal advisors, like Jeremy Margolis, became convinced that something needed to be done. Already a very progressive attorney named Judy Gold was also lobbying for something to happen, but the staff was more conservative Republicans. And when I raised the issue of something that needed to be addressed, I heard phrases like "Westward ho!" So there was a lot of debate. But meanwhile, the stories are mounting. We're not really out seeing the media for a few weeks. I'm getting lots of calls. And so I called the legal department and I said, I'm looking at, at this point, I'd already forgotten more law than I had learned, but I'm looking at the Illinois Constitution. I'm like, I think he can do something here. And I went to the assistant counsel general, and he said, absolutely, the governor has broad powers of acting in the interest of justice, including, commutation. So my suggestion was that he just call a halt to the system and study it. And I reduced the several days worth of Tribune stories to a one pager because that's what we do when we work in government. We put it on one page. And I swear to God, this is what happened. So I go back into the governor's office, and it's just the two of us in the Thompson Center, and he's got his one pager, and he's reading the bullet points aloud to me about this number of lawyers in capital punishment cases were disbarred. How does that happen? This number of lawyers were drunk. How does that happen? This number of inmates were freed by DNA. How does that happen? Later on, that became sort of the key phrase in his speeches as he went around the country explaining his decision. But almost on cue, his secretary comes back and says, the attorney general is on the phone. And so I'm just hearing one side of the conversation, but it's the attorney general I'm able to figure out telling him that there's another inmate who's exhausted all of his appeals and he was going to request an execution date and he wanted the governor to know. And so the governor looks at me and he says, why don't you hold off on that? We might have a big announcement coming. So he hangs up the phone. He's like, figure this out. Can I issue a moratorium? So that's when we got more of the staff and his friends who had been whispering in his ear together. And we worked for days and days to get something that everybody could get comfortable with. And then the governor kind of took it and made it more his own, made it more emotional. And, it was a very concise speech, but it basically, the summary of it was, until I can be sure that no innocent man or woman will be killed by the state, no one will meet that fate. Well, we knew it was a big story. The Tribune put it above the fold, front page of the Sun-Times, it was all over the state. But a few days later, I'm looking through the clips and they lit up the Colosseum in Rome in honor of the governor's decision. So that's when I knew we were onto something. And as much as he was under fire in Illinois and Chicago, he was invited all across the country and all around the globe to talk about his action, to just simply call a halt to the capital punishment system until we could figure out why there was a 50% chance of having the wrong person be executed.
That's interesting, when you talked a little bit about how that came about and just the various people and conversations, internal to these operations. And it's not just, one on one and, you and him. And it's just some people think this, some people think that. But to your point, then it also is like one day you're doing this and the next day it's like, nope, sorry, now we're working on this and total change of course. So that's a really good insight for folks as to how the internal operations work when you're working for a high level government official like that. Um, and, as we were saying, working as a government press secretary, there are highs, likely, as you said, when the Coliseum is lit up for something that you've done in a positive way and not because it's on fire. There are also lows. And think everybody's listening and probably knows a federal corruption investigation landed Governor Ryan in prison. How difficult was it for you to do your job as the spokesperson, communicating just what you're supposed to be communicating on a day-to-day basis on your responsibilities as managing this ongoing federal investigation that was going on?
I felt like every day I was in the middle of an Oliver Stone movie, where the camera's moving around and all of a sudden it's in your face,
Hmm.
and you just always were expecting the unexpected. So there was one day that started. This was late in his term, probably uh, fall of 2002, and the pressure's really mounting for what are you going to do about the capital punishment system now that your term is ending. So we'd had that moratorium for 3 years. And the uh, exonerated inmates, along with some support from Hollywood actors staged a march from uh, Stateville Prison to the Thompson Center, where the state offices were at the time, downtown Chicago. Meanwhile, the day at the Thompson Center started with the FBI showing up with subpoenas, locking down everybody's records. And of course, that got leaked out. So now I'm issuing statements about that debacle. And then end of the day comes, and now the inmates show up praising the governor, and they've got a petition, and they've got a request for him to take action. And then the governor and Mrs. Ryan get invited to go see a play that evening at a River West theater where Richard Dreyfuss, Danny Glover, Jill Clayburgh, Mike Farrell, I'm probably missing some other Hollywood stars, are putting on a show about wrongfully convicted people called The Exonerated. And they're doing photo ops with the governor afterwards and thanking him for his heroic decision and offering him support for doing the right thing. So that was just a perfect, that was like one day in the life where you got subpoenas and you got Hollywood stars and then you got all the other crappy things that go on in state government.
Wow, that's something. And did you feel that when it started to go down, was there this like sense of denial, from the governor? And obviously, there's been a handful of corruption cases. Another governor after him went to prison, and many other in state government, especially recently. And I feel like initially there's always this sense of there's nothing to see here. And did you feel that you were getting that vibe from the governor initially, or do you think he was understanding of what was going down pretty quickly?
I think in his heart, he felt that he never did anything wrong. I think there were certain things that he did that were not keeping current with the modern times of separating politics from government. I believe that the biggest problem with the Secretary of State's office, and particularly the allegations of bribes for licenses, was, and the government and the media and lots of people believe that is a direct cause of this horrible crash involving the Willis family. Um, I believe the governor would never have wanted to create a system that could have been connected to something like that. And that in his mind, it wasn't foreseeable, but he wasn't exactly a master of detail either. So he expected people to do their job. When they made, George had some people around him that were not back then, that were probably not A-team thinkers. And there was also some political expediency that he's probably as responsible for as anybody in agreeing to raise money from employees. And had he not done that, maybe he wouldn't have been able to raise as much money and then run for governor. But had he not done that, maybe he would have been further insulated from whatever skullduggery was happening at the counters at driver's license facilities. And those are those decisions that could be made in New York Minute that maybe to an elected official it doesn't click, but you can see that that was a pivotal decision. And there are three or four decisions like that that led him down that path, including who he wound up having as his inspector general. I don't want to relitigate all of that
Sure.
stuff the week that he's being laid to rest.
Sure.
I think he had a great heart, was a good family man, loved the state, loved government, loved politics, thought he was always doing the right thing, always tried to do the right thing, even when it hurt him politically. And so the fact that those previous decisions that were made on his way up, the long, slow climb up the ladder, it's tragic.
I mean, I think that that's a really great way to describe him. And I think, someone who he apparently was incredibly close to, former Republican leader Jim Durkin, would, I would think, not just say the same about Governor Ryan, but I think Jim Durkin took some of that knowledge and experience that he gained from George Ryan, about doing the right thing and not, what's the best thing for him. And that has really guided both of them, and it's just great that they maintain such a long-standing friendship. So, last but not least, and quickly, but tell us your favorite George Ryan story.
I mean, there are a ton of them. Um, you know, we'd be occasionally, he'd like to take a stroll if we had some meeting downtown, and he would stop if tourists were taking pictures, and he would grab their cameras and take pictures of them for him so that the whole family could be in a picture. Those were funny moments. He was a pharmacist coming up, and he was a pharmacist back in the old days where they had, diners in the pharmacy. And
Right.
so one evening I got invited to a dinner with a small group of some of his supporters. And he got up and started bussing the table after dinner before the coffee and dessert was served. And he wasn't exactly Mr. Macrobiotic himself. So he made a lot of his big decisions over food. So I remember when he was coming up with the commission that would study the reforms to the capital punishment system, he convened a small group meeting at Benihana's. And so he's talking about he's talking about these major decisions and having the right lawyers and citizens on this committee. And meanwhile, the chef is, going choo choo, building an onion
Same, same.
tower and dumping the egg in and having the steam come up. It was pretty absurd.
That's great. That was a great story. Well, it's been great to do this special segment on former late Governor George Ryan. And thanks everybody for tuning in to this great and lovely segment about him.
Thanks for the opportunity, Eleni.
You're always welcome, Dennis.